Hello and welcome to the Sound on Sound People and Music Industry podcast with me, Sam Ingalls. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Calcutt from Novation, and we're here to congratulate Novation on their 30th birthday. It's 30 years since the founding of the Novation company and the first Novation product, so happy birthday.
Why, thank you very much. Yeah, what a pleasure to be here.
It's great to be celebrating such a milestone for what is easily the most successful British synth company of all time.
Wow. Well, that's a lovely thing to hear. Thanks a lot, Sam. I mean, yeah, it's 30 years now since it all began, and yeah, it's been quite a journey along the way. You know, lots of synthesizers, as you say, lots of other things as well, I guess, interspersed in between it all. But some pretty exciting and quite memorable journeys along the way as well. And people, of course, you know.
Well, I think some people might be wondering why we're celebrating Novation's 30th birthday in 2022 when the BassStation was launched in 1993. And the answer to that is that the BassStation actually wasn't the first Novation product, because the first Novation product was something called the MM10, which came out in 1992, if I have my history right.
Exactly right, yeah. Yeah, the MM10 was indeed the first Novation product. And yeah, surprisingly, it wasn't a synthesizer. It was, I guess it's got to have been one of the first kind of MIDI controllers, perhaps, back at those times. I mean, MIDI controllers specifically were sort of few and far between. But yeah, it started back in 1992 by two gentlemen, Ian Jannaway and Mark Thompson. And Ian Jannaway was, a working musician. And I believe the story goes that I think he was playing saxophone in a band in Spain at the time, and got himself hold of one of the Yamaha QY10s, the little kind of, miniature, I don't know if that's the right word, but small format sequencer and, synth or rompler or whatever sort of technology was in there. And of course, that was a very small, compact sort of thing that had, it had kind of an octave of button of keys, but was a little bit kind of awkward if you were a bit more of a keys player and you wanted to use it. So the MM10 was born out of a desire really to use that particular product from Yamaha, but actually sort of turn it into a little bit more of a musician's workstation, perhaps. And so, yeah, the MM10 was essentially a two-octave mini controller, I guess, with a recess so that you could put the QY10 in there and seat it nicely. Then you've got a little truly portable workstation. And yeah, you're quite right. That's often kind of overlooked, but that was the very first Novation product back in 92.
And in a sense, that set the template for a whole series of future Novation products, because it was a hardware controller that was specific to a particular music-making device. And since then, we've had Launchpads, we've had dedicated controllers for things like Ableton and now FL Studio.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
been a really major part of Novation's product line ever since.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, it's been quite interesting that, yeah, we've had partnerships with specific kind of workflows to really sort of expand what you can do with it. I think, for example, the MM10. Well, I wasn't at Novation at the time, so I'm not sure how kind of connected to Yamaha that particular product was when it was being developed, but it certainly was a solution for another company's product that kind of opened up more possibilities for working with it. And I guess, yeah, that thread has kind of run through. And as you say, for example, our latest product, the latest product to market is the FL Key, which is a controller keyboard, but very much integrated into FL Studio. And again, that's been, it's a specifically integrated into FL Studio. So I think, we kind of look to sort of create these solutions where we think they're needed for, for these sort of collaborations, really. One of Novation's most famous products, I guess, it's got to be the Launchpad from, I think, 2009 when that one originally came out. And that was very specifically a controller for Ableton Live software at the time. Certainly at that point, Ableton was really sort of taking hold and being a more ubiquitous DAW, a very creative platform for people to work on. But like all kind of, software-based workstation sort of style workflows, really it's quite difficult to control many things at the same time. You only have a single point of contact into the software with your mouse click. And with something like Ableton, I suppose essentially designed, I mean, Ableton Live, I guess the clue's in the name there. It's, kind of for taking the computer onto stage and breaking out of that kind of linear timeline to be able to, I guess, improvise and make music in real time. It's quite difficult to be able to do that with just that single point of contact, i.e. the mouse. So the Launchpad was really born of a need to be able to control the clips and launch clips directly in Ableton. It's a very simple kind of looking box. There's actually a lot of technology inside it, of course, but, you just look at it and it's a box of buttons. But the really clever bit, I think, is really the way that that's integrated directly into the software. And the current range of Launchpads are still doing that today. I mean, we've expanded out. We're covering other areas, there's different softwares as well now. But that deep integration into the software is still there. And I think that's certainly what a lot of customers have valued. Just really, I guess, we have this mantra at work of, removing the barriers to creativity. And, if you're opening up the studio or firing up your software and then spending the first half hour setting everything up so that, you get it as you want it, that's kind of really almost killing the moment at that point. So these solutions really are just plug in, it all connects up for you, and away you go, and you're making your music. So that's really kind of the principle behind it.
So I guess one part of that is creating dedicated controllers that tie into specific pieces of software at quite a deep level. But the other strand of it is generic controllers with technologies like Automap, which are designed to get you up and running and to make this generic controller a match for whatever you're using as quickly and as painlessly as possible.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was having a good think about Automap sort of recently, and I was kind of, again, this was before I was at Focusrite. So, by the way, I should say Novation is part of the Focusrite Group of companies. But before I was at Focusrite, and obviously therefore Novation, I was using quite a bit of music software myself. And I'd kind of totally forgotten about this, but the MIDI learn that we've all gotten used to right now really wasn't a big thing back then. It wasn't easy to be able to physically control plugins and even DAWs back at that point as well. And so, when Automap came along, I think that was originally developed for the remote SL range. That offered people a very quick and easy way to be able to integrate their hardware into the workflow, but in the way that they wanted to as well. It was completely customizable. And I think, it perhaps in many ways that kind of set the precedent for MIDI learn becoming a bit more prevalent, and as we moved forward, because the ability to say, oh right, well there's the filter on my plugin synth. I want to be able to perform with that and record that performance into my DAW. Again, you could draw in the automation. You could grab the mouse and sort of waggle the mouse around on the desk, but you couldn't have that physical kind of interaction with that software instrument back at that time, or not as easily, at least anyway. So Automap, which was a pretty ambitious piece of software, really, but I think really provided a solution that possibly initially a lot of people kind of didn't realize that they needed, but once that had bedded in, then it's become, well, I suppose MIDI learn is pretty much a mainstay now of the operation. That when you're working in DAWs, MIDI learn is an expectation now, whereas back then it was quite novel and really opened up a lot of possibilities, I think.
So to what extent do you rely on the cooperation of the software manufacturers to create these solutions?
Well, I would say a great deal, to be perfectly honest. Two cases in point, let's say, the launch pads and also the launch controls and that deep integration that we have with Ableton. And the FL key as well, two current products that we're still working specifically with the developers on. I mean, with Ableton, obviously we're in discussion with those guys, and we're sort of backing to and fro, sort of asking, this is what we'd like to do. And they say, well, it might be difficult to do that, but have you thought this sort of thing? And there's quite a lot of kind of to and fro between ourselves and the software houses. But the scripts themselves, I mean, yeah, they're total collaborations. We're kind of sort of aiming for the design around the hardware and that sort of thing. And quite a lot of the time, the software developers themselves will also be involved in their, writing scripts in the back end so that all of this stuff works. And sometimes, with ImageLine, I mean, they've been a real pleasure to work with in terms of sometimes we found some sticking points when they're developing the FL key that needed to have a think about, well, how does FL Studio actually manage this? So, it's very much a collaboration there. But yeah, we do work very, very closely with the software developers to get the best that we possibly can out of the hardware as well.
Do you think it's important for that to work, for that relationship to work, that the Focusrite Group is seen as neutral with respect to all these different DAWs? There isn't a Focusrite piece of software in the same way that some manufacturers have their own DAW. Yeah,
I guess that could have been a route that we could have taken years ago, and kind of, you do see hardware manufacturers, coming up with their own DAW solutions. And to be honest as well, we have to an extent got software solutions in-house as well, because of course, as part of the Focusrite Group, we've got Amplify, who are making Amplify Studio, and of course the Launchpad app as well. I mean, the Launchpad app was essentially born out of the love for the hardware, so, we do have that sort of thing. But I think, when you consider the amount of people working on music out there and the amount of different options that these people have, I think it's pretty important that we can kind of position the Novation solution as being the right solution for a broad church, for a big range of people. And to that extent, I guess, yeah, I mean, while we do partner with specific software houses for certain things, for example, the launch key is, it's a dedicated MIDI controller that you can customize that so that you can make that work with whatever system, whatever method you want. And yeah, I think it's really important that we do have the ability to remain kind of agnostic, but where we see, there's a specific, let's say, gap to be plugged, for example, the FL key, I'm pretty certain in saying is the first dedicated keyboard-based controller for FL Studio. In that instance, to get that kind of deep level control beyond kind of standard generic control over the software, I think it's important also that we can, kind of go down that road as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we mentioned the BassStation, and it wasn't the first Novation product, but it probably was the product that put Novation on the map. What made the original BassStation so successful?
Well, I guess there's a number of factors sort of attached to that, of course. I think, Ian Jannaway kind of sort of developed the MM10 as a solution for controlling that Yamaha sequencer. But, as a result of that, there was a Novation keyboard chassis that was kind of begging to have sounds put into it as well, I think. And I don't know how Ian knew Chris Huggett, but Chris Huggett was a really important person for Novation right the way through until, his sad passing a couple of years ago. Yeah, and I think Ian kind of had this notion of, okay, let's make a synthesizer. And he got in touch with Chris to see if Chris could do a bit of help with the design work on the BassStation. Now, Chris Huggett, of course, had already been a bit of a legend in British synthesizer design. I mean, Chris, back in the late 70s, was pretty much the mind behind the Wasp synthesizer from Electronic Dream Plant. And after that sort of phase of his career, then went on to form his own company, the Oxford Synthesizer Company, and produce the Oscar. So Chris had already got, strong heritage in synthesizer design. So Ian approached Chris and sort of asked for a bit of help, I guess, in terms of developing this analog mono synth. And actually, the filter design that was used in the Wasp was kind of transitioned into being the BassStation. That and the VCA as well, I believe. And Chris kind of worked hard to help Novation bring that to the market. Now, I guess sort of musically, historically, there's quite a bit attached to it as well, because the BassStation, the original BassStation was 1993. I think it was 86 when Acid Tracks was released. And at that point, I think a lot of people had kind of realized that the TB303 had kind of been repurposed from its original design. And they were getting a bit more few and far between and a bit less available, and the prices were going up as well. And I think that the BassStation was kind of seen as let's say, cost-effective way of getting an analog bass synth sound for you to be able to work with. It did some pretty clever things as well. I mean, it was an analog, it was a DCO-based analog synthesizer, but it had MIDI on it as well. And I think I'm right in saying as well, it had CCs attached to the parameters, which again is quite unusual back at that time. I don't know of many synthesizers back then that were kind of leveraging the ability of using control change messages. But what that did mean is that you could record your live jams, tweaking the synth in real time, hands-on, but actually capture that MIDI data as well. So you'd have the ability to sort of play that back. And your live jam, your tweaking was actually recorded as well as the notes and that sort of thing. So I think it kind of captured a lot of people's imagination and attention just by, having a great sound first and foremost. I mean, that's the most important thing for any synthesizer, really. But it kind of landed pretty at a good time, I think, because, people were looking for an analog sound, which, strangely enough, there were not many analogs being made at that time. I was looking into this as well the other day, and I think there's only the Oberheim OBMX that I found that was kind of a true analog synth from that sort of time, I think. And so people were kind of really taken with that sound. And as I say, sort of, it landed at the right time musically as well, because I think people were interested in making dance music, were interested in tweaking synths while they were producing. And I think it was a big success for Novation back at the time.
And we shouldn't forget also that 1993 was kind of the high watermark of synths without any controls on them, which you had to program using buttons or a MIDI editor. And
for sure.
The BassStation had a knob for every parameter.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, it was kind of the time of romplers and samplers and a lot of digital synths as well, which were menu-based, as you say. And I think, this is one thing that at Novation, it's another kind of thread of linearity through all the products. There's always been hands-on control with the stuff that we do. I mean, as a musician myself, I'm always wanting to be physically connected to the instrument. I mean, I studied trombone. I don't suppose you could get more physically connected to an instrument than that. You're actually, blowing raspberries down a tube to get a sound. It becomes part of your body, an extension of your body. But I think, so I think that you're right. That hands-on control just gives people that kind of real-time feeling. It's like, I'm making music, I'm performing music, I'm not just programming it, and I think that's quite an important thing for the stuff that we do.
So the BassStation was an analog synthesizer, but in some ways it was kind of a hybrid instrument. It had DCOs, had some digital technology. And the next wave of Novation synths were actually digital, but they used a technology that was called Analogue Sound Modelling. So explain what that was.
Well, I guess, the sort of early to mid 90s kind of synth resurgence, people, a lot of dance music was happening at the time. Quite a lot of old analog stuff was kind of getting fished out of skips as well and kind of started to be accrued, I think largely at that time, people were kind of looking back at those analog synths and And again, you know, kind of the controls that were available on analog synths, potentiometers and that sort of thing, and, you know, the ability to be able to kind of play instruments. But essentially, you know, it was kind of all about the sound. And so ASM, Analog Sound Modelling, was essentially kind of looking back at the types of sounds available from that wealth of analog technology that had built up to the 90s, but also looking at new ways of being able to kind of implement it into the new technologies, the technologies that were around in the 90s as well. And so essentially, I guess, you know, it's VA, it's virtual analog. It's kind of a fancy way of saying that, essentially. So, you know, taking the original kind of the four friendly wave shapes that we've got, sines, squares, triangles and sawtooths, and kind of producing digital renditions of those. And I suppose also, you know, kind of largely going back to that kind of typical analog subtractive kind of workflow as well, you know, kind of architecture. You know, it's a pretty tried and tested format, that, and it works pretty well. And again, you know, there's kind of that physical connection to it. It's, you know, it's a fairly straightforward kind of architecture to understand. So yeah, I mean, essentially, through the kind of the next stage of Novation synthesizers, that was kind of largely a focus, is to kind of give that kind of immediacy of old analog synthesizers, but with, I suppose, the, you know, the capabilities of the digital chips and DSP processors that were around at the time.
And again, that was very successful for the company with instruments like the Nova and the Supernova. But more recently, still, Novation have returned to analog synths. So we've had the BassStation 2 and then the Peak and the Summit. What was the driving force behind going back to true analog designs?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, you could kind of argue there was a slight kind of analog resurgence in kind of the sort of early to mid 90s, but I think that really took hold probably around about 2013 or so, or 2012. You know, I guess other companies had been kind of looking into developing nice, relatively inexpensive analog products. I mean, I guess, you know, one company that stands out in that respect would probably be Korg, with their Monotron and those kinds of devices, and then into the Volkers as well, and kind of, I guess, making sort of fairly straightforward analog circuits that make great sounds. And again, kind of reminding people of, well, the true joy of an analog sound. I mean, you know, the analog filter, I don't think can be surpassed still to this day, personally. I mean, I'm very much hopeful that someday somebody can prove me wrong about that. But for me, that's kind of still where it's at. So, you know, in the early kind of 10s, there was this kind of resurgence into the analog world. And it wasn't just ourselves, other companies were doing it, but it felt like a great time to kind of revisit a well-known Novation product, i.e. the BassStation, and, you know, to ask Chris Huggett, if we can kind of, you know, can we make a modern analog mono synth with a BassStation? And of course, Chris is always up for a challenge. So yeah, so that's how it came about, and I think it landed just at the right time as well. Again, you know, kind of people were looking for knobby synthesizers, tweakable, but, you know, with all the trappings of it being 2010. So, you know, actual kind of proper patch storage in there, USB power as well for another thing. Of course, all the CC values and all that sort of stuff is still available. And yeah, and I think that, you know, that kind of marked, quite a nice moment for us at Novation, is to kind of, to get back into kind of, I mean, we'd always been making synthesizers, you know, beyond the Supernova and the Novas and the K stations and the A stations and all those products. The Ultranova was around, and of course the Mini Nova as well. But to get back to those kind of roots of, okay, let's build circuits that make sound, and and use that. I think it landed just at the right time. It felt great. The Peak and the Summit, which came a few years after, I think they're really interesting products. I mean, they are true hybrids. And I think there's a really interesting story behind kind of how that technology was developed as well. I mean, this was pretty much as a research project for Chris Huggett as well. He'd kind of heard tell of such things as FPGAs and kind of saw an opportunity there that they may well be able to be used to make some very, very interesting ways of building a synthesizer. So I think Chris went off and did quite a lot of research into the FPGA. And an FPGA, basically, field programmable gate array, is a processor that you can kind of build up to do whatever you want it to do. I mean, I'm not a developer. I'm not an electronics engineer at all. So I apologize if I get some of this wrong. But essentially, my understanding is that the FPGA is essentially kind of a blank canvas, and you can kind of program that to be essentially different circuits that you can kind of match together and build together and treat as if it was analog electronics. But I mean, it's still digital, but it's kind of as close to analog electronics as you can get, I guess, in terms of, kind of how you're building individual little bits of codes, actually joining them together as if it was one great big PCB at the end. And the other interesting thing about the FPGA is as well, whereas with DSPs, you're kind of, you've got stacked kind of commands. So you're running a big thread of commands. The FPGA can run several processes in parallel as well. So it makes it really, really efficient in that respect. So Chris went away and kind of, I did a bit of deep thinking about how it could be used. And yeah, and I think really it was kind of a really important moment in synthesis history. I mean, obviously, I work at Novation, so I'm going to be saying this sort of thing. But for me, I think it was really important because certainly with the Peak synthesizer, we actually named the oscillators that we were able to get from that. We call them the Oxford oscillators. I mean, that's largely, kind of a nod of the cap to Chris and his Oxford synthesizer company, I guess. But essentially, those oscillators are being produced at incredibly high resolution. I mean, to my knowledge, some of the highest resolution digital oscillators that you can get hold of in a commercially available synthesizer. I mean, if you think about a traditional DSP, you've got the processor there, and then you've got a DAC at the end of it as well to turn that into an analog signal that we can all hear. And those DACs are running at kind of traditional sample rates. If you kind of your 44.1, 48 kilohertz, all that sort of stuff. I mean, there's oversampling available, and that is used to a large extent as well. But with the FPGA, Chris was able to get the oscillators, the digitally generated or numerically generated, I should say, oscillators off that FPGA, but at incredibly high clock speeds. I mean, 24 megahertz. So, megahertz is millions of times per second. So instead of 44,100 steps in a sine wave, you've now got 24 million of them per second. And to that end, it produced some incredibly pure sounding oscillators that are digitally generated, but in terms of the way that they kind of behave, not necessarily in tuning discrepancies and distortions and stuff like that, but in terms of the pure waveform output that they're able to do. I mean, they're pretty indistinguishable, I would say, from analog generated oscillators these days. And so, that using that technology is really kind of, in my opinion, has really pushed forward what's possible. What I find quite interesting is that some other companies as well have actually, started to kind of employ a similar technique, I guess, now. I think that's a really nice little kind of recognition of the fact that this is a really strong way to go for synthesizers in the future. The other thing about the Peak and the Summit as well, of course, is that they are hybrids. So that digital front end, the oscillators, are digital, but then the signal path after the oscillators have been generated is pure analog. So you've got analog VCAs, analog filters, distortions, all the kind of the usual good stuff that you would want in analog, and the analog world is still there. But the benefit of having the digital oscillators is that you can do so much kind of more. I mentioned before about our 4 friendly wave shapes that we've got with analog, but with digital, of course, the sky's the limit. You can do whatever you want. And that allows, for things, for example, like wavetables to be generated in the FPGA as well. So I mean, I think it's a very, very clever piece of technology, really, and a quite very clever way of being able to use it. And then, of course, the Peak was the initial synth in that range, if you can call it a range, I suppose you could, which is an 8-voice desktop system. And then we thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if we stuck 2 inside a keyboard and actually had, a nice performance keyboard that is using that same kind of technology, getting that same great sound, but actually have 2 of them in there, so we can either treat it for, as a 16-voice poly or as a bitimbral instrument as well. And that's really where Summit came from. So I genuinely think it's a really important moment in synthesizer development. That's my personal take on it, at least, anyway.
So yeah, one thing about the Peak, like you said, is it's a desktop instrument, and that's actually a really significant change that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years of synthesizer design. I mean, when Novation started in the 90s, everyone wanted rack mount synths, and things like the Supernova and some of the Novas were 19-inch rack mount units. Now everyone wants desktop instruments. What do you think's driven that change?
Well, I guess if you think back to the kind of the 90s, at that point, people were going into professional studios. I mean, they could have been project studios, but they were commercial studios, and that's really where you would go to record your stuff if you were a bit more serious about what you were doing. And in that kind of scenario, the rack was everywhere. It's a standardized format that you would use. Your ADATs were 19-inch, everything, your compressors were 19-inch, all that sort of stuff. And I guess it made a lot of sense that synthesizers would be going into those kind of spaces and would be, put into rack cases at that point. And then, of course, as you kind of move through to the late 90s and certainly into the early noughties, the computer was becoming more and more ubiquitous. And, it wasn't too long where you could have a similar sized recording studio in your bedroom. And in the bedroom, you wouldn't necessarily have a ton of racks or rack cases. You'd probably have, well, in many instances, I remember kind of cobbling together a sort of a makeshift table out of a fire door at one point, So, you have a desktop. So at that point, I guess, there's a bit more kind of value attached to the fact that, these things are, they're going to sit on a desktop, not necessarily in a rack now. I mean, I've got a pretty nice room here with lots and lots of stuff, and I have no rack mount stuff in here whatsoever. I mean, that's not true. I do have a rack under my desk, but that's tucked away in the corner and never gets turned on. There's nothing in there that I actually need to access. Everything else is kind of visible and on top of the desk. I suppose there's another thing about this as well, is that part of the currency of this kind of making music, I think, is also the visual side. I mean, thinking back to the Launchpad, for example, the Launchpad kind of was born just on the cusp of YouTube sort of taking off. And, and at first, what was a controller for being able to launch clips, primarily, I would say, on stage, and, for that, kind of designed for that kind of format, suddenly became something that was a bit more visual, and people were kind of able to, I suppose, film their performances and share it that way as well. Now, I guess if things were still in racks, it wouldn't have been that interesting, really, to just point a camera at a rack that had just been receiving MIDI and CC data, and there's your performance. So I think, I think there's quite a lot of show and tell with this gear as well now. And, for a lot of people, YouTube is the outlet. So it's got to look good. It's got to be visual. It's got to be interesting to look at as well. So I guess in many ways, that's kind of, I mean, the rack format is still there, but it's a lot less kind of prevalent these days, I think, and certainly in synthesizers for sure. Yeah. So, I guess that's perhaps one of the reasons why.
Well, another trend that we've witnessed in recent years is kind of a move away from having soft synths with hardware controllers to hardware instruments that don't need to have a computer attached. And actually, Novation have a perfect example in the Circuit, which is a great product that you can use on its own. I mean, you can use it with a computer, but it doesn't need the computer to be there. What's driving that transition, do you think? Is it just convenience?
Well, I mean, I think there's many kind of answers to that. I mean, one that you hear a lot is, people are kind of pushing the mouse around all day at work. They're staring at screens all day. And a lot of people, for the last thing that they want to do when they get home in their kind of, relaxing time and their fun time of actually making music, is that they want to step away from that screen, and therefore, they want something else to focus on, something that isn't necessarily, just looking at a great big sort of 19 or 27-inch screen or whatever it is. And I do think that's quite a large part of it. Yeah, I mean, again, back to the sort of the YouTube's an outlet for a lot of people. A lot of kind of non-professional musicians and some professionals as well, and sort of semi-professionals, that is kind of their kind of outlet for their output as well. And again, it's not that much fun really just watching move a mouse around on a screen. So I think, there is very much kind of a trend for people to kind of sort of show their chops, see what I can do on this piece of hardware. Yeah, it's just generally more interesting to see. But also having products that are kind of dedicated to do a specific job, but to do it really well, I think is really important as well. I mean, we are talking about musical instruments at the end of the day. The computer's a catch-all. I mean, you can work out your finances on it, you can book a train ticket on it, or you could go make a banging track if you wanted to. It does so much stuff, whereas, something like a circuit is very much focused on the workflow that it provides. And, it's a big workflow as well. You can do a lot of stuff on those little boxes, but it is focused in that workflow. And I think I mentioned before, I sort of did many years playing the trombone in orchestras and, getting told off by my teachers for not practicing. It's a musical instrument. I think there's very much a lot to be said for actually kind of learning how to play musical instruments. And these are musical instruments. So, I know that, the next shiny new thing is always a very big temptation, certainly today. But actually having something that focuses the concentration and focuses the mind on kind of into this workflow, I think is, it's a very rewarding kind of way of working. I think that's one of the things that's really helped with the circuits. I mean, I guess the other things to mention there as well is kind of the portability as well. So, the current circuits, the circuit tracks and the circuit rhythm, I mean, they've got, they have a rechargeable battery in there. So, if you've got a USB socket nearby, you can charge up your battery and then off you go to the park and make music there as well. And I think this notion of having something that's small enough to go into the backpack, but fun enough and powerful enough to be able to create some really, strong, compelling pieces of music with, I think that's quite a lot of the attraction to that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit earlier about the relationship between Novation and its now parent company, Focusrite. Tell us a little bit about how that works, because within Focusrite, is Novation still an independent company with its own culture, or is it more of a division within a larger company?
Okay, I think that's a great question, Sam, because I mean, since 2004, Novation has been with Focusrite. Focusrite started back in, I think it was 85 when Focusrite initially started up. And Novation joined Focusrite, as I say, it was 2004. And so by the time I joined the company, which I think was 2012, I've been there for 10 years now. So when I joined Focusrite, I pick up the phone and say, hello, Focusrite Novation. So it was very much, it's Focusrite on one side doing the audio interface side, doing the, the preamp stuff, RedNet as well, which was sort of been developed, all the kind of the audio sort of utilities that we all need to get the audio in and out of the various different recording mediums that we're working with. And Novation was, kind of on the opposite, just in the same room, but on the opposite desk sort of thing. So, that to me, it was a very strong connection between Focusrite and Novation. So I would kind of, back in those days, certainly think, okay, these are our two brands. Okay, Focusrite is the parent company, but very much there's a lot of kind of symbiosis between those two brands and kind of who we were and what we were doing. And then, of course, in more recent times, we've had some other brands join the Focusrite Group. So it's been expanding out. Martin Audio, Adam Audio, and one of the latest ones as well, of course, Sequential, another synth manufacturer. And yeah, I mean, they are all their own personalities. They're all their own brands, and they're largely doing their own thing. I guess the kind of the Focusrite Group umbrella there is really kind of facilitating all these different kind of aspects to kind of carry on doing what they do and do it hopefully better, because we've got a bit more kind of leverage and sway within the way that we work by having them sort of all under one roof. But yeah, I mean, in terms of how it operates, yeah, we have a specific Novation team. I mean, sometimes people are seconded to other parts of the business to do certain things, specific things and that sort of thing. But I'd say there is a kind of a core Novation there, much as, there's a core Focusrite, there's definitely a core Sequential, because they're over in San Francisco. We're based in High Wycombe in the UK. And again, Adam Audio are over in Berlin too. So there's, they're all quite separate kind of entities, but are kind of working pretty closely together, I guess. But we're kind of still quite separate in terms of the way that we work and the way that we develop and the way things are brought to the market as well.
I wanted to ask you about the relationship with Sequential in particular, because you could actually see some Novation products, particularly this Summit, as almost direct competitors for some of Sequential's products. Is that an issue for you?
No, not at all. I mean, no, I would say that we're okay, so I mean, I think in terms of synthesizers at the moment, I mean, there are so many different companies producing synthesizers now. I mean, it's without a shadow of a doubt, it's the strongest period for that instrument ever. I mean, it's established now, and there are so many companies kind of looking at new and interesting ways of doing their thing. And I think there's enough space there for us all to exist and for us all to kind of bring new innovations to the market and new ways of working and new approaches. And so, I've been a fan of sequential synths as much as I have Novation for a long time. So, in my studio here, I mean, I'm looking around. Yeah, sure, I've got a Summit, I've got a BassStation, but equally I've got a Buchla here. I've got an ARP 2600 next to me. I mean, so there's loads, that's the way that we all work. We're not just kind of, okay, this is the only piece of hardware I will ever buy and will ever use. So I think there's enough space there for us to really quite happily coexist. But specifically with Novation and Sequential, I think we've very much got our own personalities as well. Sequential, of course, have been there since the very early days and making some, incredibly important instruments as well. And, they're doing different things to Novation. Most recently, from the Oberheim side of things as well, which is really exciting, the OBX8 as well. And, they're really focused on that sort of pure analog kind of, I guess heritage in a way, but kind of heritage for the 21st century. Is that a thing? Does that make sense? But kind of really kind of taking those classic products and bring them forward. And then, you look at the Peak, and there's this kind of new weird way of creating oscillators in there, digital oscillators. Sure, there's analog electronics in there as well to kind of, to complement that. But I think they're two quite different kind of personalities. And, I think, there's definitely space for both of those kind of approaches to work. Now, I guess one of the real benefits for Novation and Sequential to be under the same roof now is the fact that, there's a lot more experience and kind of engineering chops that can be called on as and when is necessary. So, that's only going to be a good thing, I think. For the moment, though, at this point, things are totally separate. I have to say that, Sequential is still doing their thing over in San Francisco and, doing what they do incredibly well. And Novation, we're following our own kind of dedicated Novation path over here in the UK. And of course, we meet up from time to time and kind of discuss things. But, in terms of projects and stuff that's going on, that's largely kind of kept sort of still quite separate. So, I mean, I think, it was really interesting. I never forget the moment we got the news that Focusrite Group had acquired Sequential. And as an employee of Focusrite, I kind of found out at the same time as everybody else in the world did, of course, because an acquisition like that isn't something that we kind of can really know about, I suppose. So I did actually fall off the chair at that point. I certainly jumped off it and did a merry dance in the living room for certain. Yeah, I mean, that was a really exciting day. But in terms of those two brands coexisting, there's nothing has changed at this point in time. I don't expect it to. And I think there's definitely space for us to both carry on the same path, that we're on the same trajectory, and just work smartly together.
So talking of sequential brings me to another anniversary, actually, which is next year, 2023. It's the 40th anniversary of the famous demonstration at the NAMM show in which their sequential Prophet 600 was hooked up to a Roland Jupiter 6 and MIDI was shown to the public for the first time.
Wow, yeah.
And I mean, nowadays, of course, we have MIDI 2.0 and MPE and other sort of extensions to the original MIDI protocol. How are Novation taking advantage of those possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely stuff that's on the radar. It's not stuff that I think we're going to see from Novation in the immediate future. But as it establishes itself and kind of gets a bit more kind of locked in, I guess it's that first thing. It's like, who's going to be first out the gates with this kind of properly? But yeah, I mean, for certain, for sure, the technology is definitely being kind of looked at and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's like everybody else at the minute, it's taking a bit of time to kind of find its little pathway and kind of establish itself. But certainly, I think one of the key things I've always thought about Novation, and this is from way before I joined the company as well, is, I mean, it's almost in the name, as it were, but the innovation that the company has kind of harnessed, I think it's been something I've been really, really impressed with. I mean, things, we talked about the Launchpad before, but there was nothing quite like that out there at that point. Other things as well, things like MIDI controllers that could fit onto the side of your 1210 turntables and give you kind of control over your virtual DJing software. Another one, this is a particular fond one for me, the Novation Twitch. I don't know if you remember that, but that was, again, a DJ controller that essentially was the first DJ controller that got rid of the platters. It was just all based around touch strips and also some performance controls as well underneath. Now, at the time, it was a really difficult thing to get people to kind of buy into, I guess, a DJ controller without turntables or without jog wheels. This is, it's kind of insane. But if you look at DJ controllers today, I'd say the majority of them are based around that notion of kind of touch strip as opposed to specific jog wheels. And also there's a lot of performance stuff on there. So yeah, so that innovation I think has always been baked into what Novation has been about. So again, from the point of view of MIDI 2.0 and that sort of stuff as well, it's definitely something that we probably will see in the future. But, when that will be, I don't know at this point.
Well, as you say, Chris, 30 years of innovation, 30 years of great products from Novation. So happy birthday, Novation. Thanks ever so much for taking part in this podcast. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on.
I've been Sam Ingalls. I've been interviewing Chris Calcutt from Focusrite Novation. Thanks for listening and see you again soon. Goodbye. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. And just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcasts website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels.